Chapter 17. The Eternal Husband. Almost exactly 2 years had passed since the incidents we have described. We meet Velchaninov again on a beautiful summer day, in the train on one of our newly opened railways. He was going to Odessa for his own pleasure, to see one of his friends, and also with a view to something else of an agreeable nature. He hoped through that friend to arrange a meeting with an extremely interesting woman whose acquaintance he had long been eager to make. Without going into details, we will confine ourselves to observing that he had become entirely transformed, or rather reformed, during those 2 years. Of his old hypochondria scarcely a trace remained. Of the various reminiscences and anxiety, the result of illness which had beset him 2 years before in Petersburg at the time of his unsuccessful lawsuit, nothing remained but a certain secret shame at the consciousness of his faint-heartedness. What partly made up for it was the conviction that it would never happen again, and that no one would ever know of it. It was true that at that time he had given up all society, had even begun to be slovenly in his dress, had crept away out of sight of everyone, and that, of course, must have been noticed by all. But he so readily acknowledged his transgressions, and at the same time with such a self-confident air of new life and vigor, that everyone immediately forgave his momentary falling away. In fact, those whom he had given up greeting were the first to recognize him and hold out their hands, and without any tiresome questions, just as though he had been absent on his own personal affairs, which were no business of theirs, and had only just come back from a distance. The cause of all these salutary changes for the better was, of course, the winning of his lawsuit. Velchaninov gained in all 60,000 rubles. No great sum, of course, but of extreme importance to him. To begin with, he felt himself on firm ground again, and so he felt satisfied at heart. He knew for certain now that he would not, like a fool, squander this money as he had squandered his first 2 fortunes, and that he had enough for his whole life. "However the social edifice may totter, whatever trumpet call they're sounding," he thought sometimes as he watched and heard all the marvelous and incredible things that were being done around him and all over Russia. "Whatever shape people and ideas may take, I shall always have just such a delicate, dainty dinner as I am sitting down to now, and so I'm ready to face anything." This voluptuous, comfortable thought by degrees gained complete possession of him, and produced a transformation in his physical, to say nothing of his moral, nature. He looked quite a different man from the sluggard whom we have described 2 years before, and to whom such unseemly incidents had befallen. He looked cheerful, serene, and dignified. Even the ill-humored wrinkles that had begun to appear under his eyes and on his forehead had almost been smoothed away. The very tint of his face had changed. His skin was whiter and ruddier. At the moment he was sitting comfortably in a first-class carriage, and a charming idea was suggesting itself to his mind. The next station was a junction, and there was a new branch line going off to the right. He asked himself, how would it be to give up the direct way for the moment and turn off to the right? There, only 2 stations away, he could visit another lady of his acquaintance who had only just returned from abroad, and was now living in a provincial isolation. Very tedious for her, but favorable for him. And so it would be possible to spend his time no less agreeably than at Odessa, especially as he would not miss his visit there either. But he was still hesitating and could not quite make up his mind. He was waiting for something to decide him. Meanwhile, the station was approaching, and that something was not far off. At this station, the train stopped 40 minutes, and the passengers had the chance of having dinner. At the entrance to the dining room for the passengers of the first and second class, there was, as there usually is, a crowd of impatient and hurried people, and as is also usual, perhaps, a scandalous scene took place. A lady from a second-class carriage, who was remarkably pretty but somewhat too gorgeously dressed for travelling, was dragging after her an Ulan, a very young and handsome officer, who was trying to tear himself out of her hands. The youthful officer was extremely drunk, and the lady, to all appearance some elder relative, would not let him go, probably apprehending that he would make a dash for the refreshment bar. Meanwhile, in the crush, the Ulan was jostled by a young merchant who was also disgracefully intoxicated. He had been hanging about the station for the last 2 days, drinking and scattering his money among the companions who surrounded him, without succeeding in getting into the train to continue his journey. A scuffle followed. The officer shouted. The merchant swore. The lady was in despair, and, trying to draw the Ulan away from the conflict, kept exclaiming in an imploring voice, "Mitenka! Mitenka!" This seemed to strike the young merchant as too scandalous. Everyone laughed indeed, but the merchant was more offended than ever at the outraged, as he conceived it, unpropriety. "Oh, I say, Mitenka!" she pronounced reproachfully, mimicking the shrill voice of the lady. "And not ashamed before folks!" He went staggering up to the lady, who had rushed to the first chair and succeeded in making the Ulan sit down beside her, stared at them both contemptuously, and drawled in a sing-song voice, "You're a trollop, you are, dragging your tail in the dirt." The lady uttered a shriek and looked about her piteously for some means of escape. She was both ashamed and frightened, and, to put the finishing touch, the officer sprang up from the chair and, with a yell, made a dash at the merchant, but, slipping, fell back into the chair with a flop. The laughter grew louder around them, and no one dreamed of helping her. But Velchaninov came to the rescue. He seized the merchant by the collar and, turning him round, thrust him 5 paces away from the frightened lady. And with that the scene ended. The merchant was overwhelmed by the shock and by Velchaninov's impressive figure. His companions led him away. The dignified countenance of the elegantly dressed gentleman produced a strong effect on the jeering crowd. The laughter subsided. The lady flushed, and, almost in tears, was overflowing with expressions of gratitude. The Ulan mumbled, "Thanks, thanks," and made as though to hold out his hand to Velchaninov, but instead of doing so, suddenly took it into his head to recline at full length with his feet on the chairs. "Mitenka!" the lady moaned reproachfully, clasping her hands in horror. Velchaninov was pleased with the adventure and with the whole situation. The lady attracted him. She was evidently a wealthy provincial, gorgeously but tastelessly dressed, and with rather ridiculous manners. In fact, she combined all the characteristics that guarantee success to a Petersburg gallant with designs on the fair sex. A conversation sprang up. The lady bitterly complained of her husband, who had disappeared as soon as he had got out of the carriage, and so is the cause of it all, for whenever he is wanted he runs off somewhere. "Naturally," the Ulan muttered. "Ah, Mitenka!" She clasped her hands again. "Well, the husband will catch it," thought Velchaninoff. "What's his name? I will go and look for him," he suggested. "Palich," responded the Ulan. "Your husband's name is Pavel Pavlovitch?" Velchaninoff asked with curiosity. And suddenly a familiar bald head was thrust between him and the lady. In a flash he had a vision of the Zalabinins' garden, the innocent games and a tiresome bald head being incessantly thrust between him and Nadezhda Fedosyevna. "Here you are at last!" cried his wife hysterically. It was Pavel Pavlovitch himself. He gazed in wonder and alarm at Velchaninoff, as panic-stricken at the sight of him as though he had been a ghost. His stupefaction was such that he evidently could not for some minutes take in what his offended spouse was explaining in a rapid and irritable flow of words. At last, with a start, he grasped all the horror of his position. His own guilt, and Mitenka's behavior. "And that this monsieur," this was how the lady for some reason described Velchaninoff, "has been a savior and guardian angel to us, while you were always out of the way when you were wanted." Velchaninoff suddenly burst out laughing. "Why, we are friends! We've been friends since childhood!" he exclaimed to the astonished lady. Putting his right arm with patronizing familiarity round the shoulders of Pavel Pavlovitch, who smiled a pale smile, "Hasn't he talked to you of Velchaninoff?" "No, he never has," the lady responded, somewhat disconcerted. "You might introduce me to your wife, you faithless friend." "Lipochka, it really is Monsieur Velchaninoff," Pavel Pavlovitch was beginning, but he broke off abashed. His wife turned crimson and flashed an angry look at him, probably for the Lipochka. "And only fancy, he never let me know he was married, and never invited me to the wedding. But you, Olympiada—" "Semyonovna," Pavel Pavlovitch prompted. "Semyonovna," the Ulan, who had dropped asleep, echoed suddenly. "You must forgive him, Olympiada Semyonovna, for my sake, in honor of our meeting. He's a good husband." And Velchaninoff gave Pavel Pavlovitch a friendly slap on the shoulder. I was only away for a minute, my love," Pavel Pavlovitch was beginning to say. "And left your wife to be insulted," Lipochka put in at once. "When you're wanted, there's no finding you. When you're not wanted, you're always at hand." "Where you're not wanted, where you're not wanted, where you're not wanted," the Ulan chimed in. Lipochka was almost breathless with excitement. She knew it was not seemly before Velchaninoff, and flushed, but could not restrain herself. "Where you shouldn't be, you are too attentive, she burst out.
Under the bed. He looks for a lover under the bed, where he shouldn't,
muttered Mitenka, suddenly growing extremely excited. But there was no doing anything with Mitenka by now. It all ended pleasantly, however, and they got upon quite friendly terms. Pavel Pavlovitch was sent to fetch coffee and soup. Olympiada Semyonovna explained to Velchaninoff that they were on their way from O, where her husband had a post in the service, to spend 2 months at their country place, that it was not far off, only 30 miles from that station, that they had a lovely house and garden there, that they always had the house full of visitors, that they had neighbors too, and if Alexey Ivanovitch would be so good as to come and stay with them in their rustic solitude, she would welcome him as their guardian angel, for she could not recall without horror what would have happened if... and so on and so on. In fact, he was her guardian angel.
And Saviour,
the Ulan insisted with heat. Velchaninoff thanked her politely, and replied that he was always at her service, that he was an absolutely idle man with no duties of any sort, and that Olympiada Semyonovna's invitation was most flattering. He followed this at once with sprightly conversation, successfully introducing 2 or 3 compliments. Lipochka blushed with pleasure, and as soon as Pavel Pavlovitch returned, she told him enthusiastically that Alexey Ivanovitch had been so kind as to accept her invitation to spend a whole month with them in the country, and had promised to come in a week. Pavel Pavlovitch smiled in mute despair. Olympiada Semyonovna shrugged her shoulders at him and turned her eyes up to the ceiling. At last they got up. Again a gush of gratitude. Again the guardian angel. Again, Mitenka. And Pavel Pavlovitch at last escorted his wife and the Ulan to their compartment. Velchaninoff lighted a cigar and began pacing to and fro on the balcony in front of the station. He knew that Pavel Pavlovitch would run out again at once to talk to him till the bell rang. And so it happened. Pavel Pavlovitch promptly appeared before him with an uneasy expression in his face and whole figure. Velchaninoff laughed, took him by the elbow in a friendly way, led him to the nearest bench, sat down himself, and made him sit down beside him. He remained silent. He wanted Pavel Pavlovitch to be the first to speak. "So you are coming to us?" faltered the latter, going straight to the point.
"I knew that would be it. You haven't changed in the least," laughed Velchaninoff. "Why, do you mean to say—" He slapped him again on the shoulder. "Do you mean to say you could seriously imagine for a moment that I could actually come and stay with you, and for a whole month too?"
Pavel Pavlovitch was all of a twitter.
"So you are not coming?"
he cried, not in the least disguising his relief.
I'm not coming, Velchaninoff laughed complacently.
He could not have said himself, however, why he felt so particularly amused, but he was more and more amused as time went on.
Do you really mean it?"
And saying this, Pavel Pavlovitch actually jumped up from his seat in a flutter of suspense.
"Yes, I've told you already that I'm not coming, you queer fellow."
"If that's so, What am I to say to Olympiada Semyonovna a week hence, when she will be expecting you and you don't come?"
"What a difficulty! Tell her I've broken my leg or something of that sort."
"She won't believe it,"
Pavel Pavlovitch drawled plaintively. "And you'll catch it?" Velchaninoff went on laughing. "But I observe, my poor friend, that you tremble before your delightful wife, don't you?"
Pavel Pavlovitch tried to smile, but it did not come off. That Velchaninoff had refused to visit them was a good thing, of course, but that he should be over-familiar to him about his wife was disagreeable. Pavel Pavlovitch winced. Velchaninoff noticed it. Meanwhile, the second bell rang. They heard a shrill voice from the train anxiously calling Pavel Pavlovitch. The latter moved, fidgeted in his chair, but did not rise at the first summons, evidently expecting something more from Velchaninoff, no doubt another assurance that he would not come and stay with them.
"What was your wife's maiden name?" Velchaninoff inquired, as though unaware of Pavel Pavlovitch's anxiety.
"She is a priest's daughter," replied the latter in uneasy trepidation, listening and looking towards the train.
"Ah, I understand you married her for her beauty."
Pavel Pavlovitch winced again.
"And who's this Mitenka with you?"
"Oh, he's a distant relation of ours, that is of mine, the son of my deceased cousin. His name's Golubchikov. He was degraded for disorderly behavior in the army, but now he has been promoted again, and we have been getting his equipment. He's an unfortunate young man."
"To be sure, the regular thing. The party's complete," thought Velchaninoff.
"Pavel Pavlovitch!" The call came again from the train, and by now with a marked tone of irritation in the voice.
"Pavel Pavlovitch!"
they heard in another thick voice. Pavel Pavlovitch fidgeted and moved restlessly again, but Velchaninoff took him by the elbow and detained him.
"How would you like me to go this minute and tell your wife how you tried to cut my throat?"
What? Pavel Pavlovitch was terribly alarmed. "God forbid!" "Pavel Pavlovitch! Pavel Pavlovitch!" voices were heard calling again.
"Well, be off now,"
said Velchaninoff, letting him go at last, and still laughing genially. "So you won't come?" Pavel Pavlovitch whispered for the last time, almost in despair, and even put his hands before him with the palms together in his old style.
"Why, I swear I won't come. Run, there'll be trouble, you know."
And with a flourish he held out his hand to him, and was startled at the result. Pavel Pavlovitch did not take his hand. He even drew his own hand back. The third bell rang. In one instant something strange happened to both of them. Both seemed transformed. Something, as it were, quivered and burst out in Velchaninoff, who had been laughing only just before. He clutched Pavel Pavlovitch by the shoulder and held him in a tight and furious grip.
"If I hold out this hand to you,"
showing the palm of his left hand, where a big scar from the cut was still distinct,
"you certainly might take it," he whispered with pale and trembling lips.
Pavel Pavlovitch too turned pale, and his lips trembled too. A convulsive quiver ran over his face.
"And Lisa?" he murmured in a rapid whisper. And suddenly his lips, his cheeks, and his chin began to twitch, and tears gushed from his eyes. Velchaninoff stood before him, stupefied.
"Pavel Pavlovitch! Pavel Pavlovitch!"
They heard a scream from the train as though someone were being murdered. And suddenly the whistle sounded. Pavel Pavlovitch roused himself, flung up his hands, and ran full speed to the train. The train was already in motion, but he managed to hang on somehow and went flying to his compartment. Velchaninoff remained at the station, and only in the evening set off on his original route in another train. He did not turn off to the right to see his fair friend. He felt too much out of humor. And how he regretted it afterwards. This concludes The Eternal Husband. I will be appending one final installment to this sequence with some concluding thoughts on the novella. You are welcome to join me there. Otherwise, thank you for listening, and I hope you enjoyed this Let's Read experience.